So I want to wrap up the semester here with a question a lot of people ask. Is there life anywhere else in the universe? We know about life on Earth, but we've not found life elsewhere. We've considered life elsewhere. Giordano Bruno even suggested that in about 1600. He suggested that all the stars did not look like they're moving in the sky as Earth moved because they're so far away, that possibly being that far away, they're as bright as the sun. Maybe they are suns. Maybe as suns, they have planets, and maybe the planets have people on them. And then he said this was right during the time of the Inquisitions, and he said at that point that Christ came and got crucified on all those planets around all the stars, and that got him in trouble for heresy, and they burned him at the stake. And then later they came out and said, "Oh wait, he was actually right about the planets being like Earth." Because at the time, no one thought that they thought the planets were just dots that moved in the sky. And he also had said, well, Earth goes around the sun, planets go around the sun, so the planets are worlds like Earth. And that changed the idea what a planet was. And so he was right on that part, so they put a statue up in his honor to say, oh, sorry, all better now. Nowadays we're a little more tolerant of the idea of aliens, possibility that there's life that's out there. So aliens come in all different shapes and sizes in mass media and in public imagination and marketing and so forth. But they actually considered this seriously even in 1969 when the Apollo missions went to the moon. There was actually some consideration that maybe there's life on the moon. Now, in thinking about that, they were also considering, what would happen if that life came back to Earth, and so they considered the possibilities. And one train of thought was that look at what happened to Europeans came to the New World. They brought viruses with them, such as smallpox and other viruses, other diseases that the local inhabitants had no resistance to. And so what happened was that plagues, pandemics, swept throughout the Americas and killed the majority of the population, particularly in Mesoamerica, as a result of being exposed to a virus that no one had any resistance to. And so the thought was, if there's life on the moon, maybe if it came back to Earth, it would get loose and kill lots of people. And so the astronauts, when they came back, were actually loaded into this RV, converted RV, that was sealed up and sealed in there. And so this was called a mobile containment unit. And so they stayed on there the entire time on the ship until they got back to land, loaded it onto a flatbed trailer, drove it to an airport, stuffed it in the back of a cargo plane, flew it to Houston, where they'd built a special building here, which is actually, it's getting gotten old. It's just now being torn down in Houston. But that building was the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, which housed hermetically sealed apartments for them to live in for a while they were in quarantine, and to make sure they didn't bring back some deadly virus. And then they had genetically modified mice that crawled across the lunar samples, genetically modified to be super susceptible to any kind of disease. They didn't get sick, and they finally figured out that the moon had no life on it. When the Viking spacecraft went to Mars, it performed in the mid 1970s, performed some experiments looking for life, wondering if maybe Mars had life, and came back with inconclusive but probable no. Later missions have not found any evidence of life, though the Curiosity rover has found that conditions may well have been suitable for life on Mars when Mars was very, very young. And so the next mission to Mars should actually have the ability to look a little more detailed for the possibilities of life in the past on Mars. And there are tantalizing clues. For example, in 1984, they found this meteorite, which a decade or so later, they announced had these little microscopic structures in them, which they speculated may have been formed by life forms of some sort, microscopic life forms. Other scientists came along and said, no, they're too small. Then others said, well, maybe. Then others said, maybe not. And so the general conclusion is that these structures are not evidence of life, but from geological activity. The reason we don't think they're life is they're too small. In order to be life, there are certain things that you need. You need to have some kind of genetic material. DNA makes the genetic material for living organisms on Earth. And then you need some other sort of cytoplasm. You need some kind of just the goo, the chemical goo that makes up life. You need to have other sort of organelles in there that help the chemistry work. And then you got to contain the entire thing in some fashion to contain it from the environment. So this is pretty much the smallest that life can be, and that would contain all that. Certain kinds of nanobacteria, but the little nodules they found in that rock from Mars were much too small for that. Okay. The other thing is, the rock was actually part of a meteorite. The big asteroid hit Mars, blew it into space, and it flew around and landed on Earth. And so, if it were fossilized life, it'd be long dead. Okay. Well, maybe. There's actually an interesting idea, and that is that the basic building blocks for life, organic molecules, might actually be present in comets. Well, we know comets have organic molecules in them. We know comets have amino acids, the basic building blocks you need for life. Doesn't mean comets have life in them. So in the outer parts of proplyds, in the Oort clouds, in the Bok globules, it's possible that all the chemistry necessary to make life is occurring. And then all you've got to do is deliver that life to a suitable planet. And so that could be through comets or asteroids hitting the planet. But could life survive something like that? And there's actually an idea called Panspermia, in which that the basic building blocks for life form in the interstellar medium, and they seed planets, which means that all life would actually be very similar to one another. There's another idea called Transpermia, and that is that life could actually move from planet to planet. For example, that meteorite that got blasted loose from an asteroid impact on Mars threw the rock up at escape velocity, flew across the solar system, and then landed on Earth thousands of years later. But could life survive that? Because it would be a horrible trip, and it'd have to go through the hard vacuum of space, high radiation environment, high temperature coming back to Earth. Well, that's an interesting thing, because Apollo 12, when they went to the moon, landed a short walk from an unmanned spacecraft called Surveyor 3 that had been to the moon a year earlier. And so the astronauts went over there and they brought back parts of Surveyor 3 to study how does the radiation environment of space affect human objects that have been sitting up there for a long time. Well, what they discovered was that there were actually viable bacteria on one of the cameras they brought back. They'd been sitting on the lunar surface under vacuum, intense heat, and hard radiation. It was Streptococcus. Someone building it was infected and left bacteria on the camera when they were building the spacecraft, went to the moon, and it sat there, and it was actually still viable when it got back, which means that possibly some of these organisms can survive harsh environments. When the Columbia burned up on reentry over Texas, the Space Shuttle Columbia, when it came in, it broke apart, burned up, and there were some experiments, biology experiments that were being done on board, growing bacteria. And one of the experiments, right before they launched, turned out to be contaminated by something. And so they couldn't get to it to, like, stop it. So they just went and flew it, and the contamination grew while it was in space. But that one part of the experiment was isolated from the rest. Well, when it came back, they found bits and pieces of this experiment, returned it to the original scientist at Texas State University, and they found that all the organisms they sent up there to study were killed in reentry, but the contamination survived. And so it's actually possible that life could transfer from planet to planet. Again, that's the idea of transpermia. So it's possible that life could form one place and then be translocated to someplace else. And so if we ever do find life out there, it'd be very fascinating to find out, is it entirely different from Earth, or is it very similar to Earth life? If it's very similar to Earth life, it could be Earth life that got moved to another planet, or it could be that Earth life originated somewhere else, or it could be that all life is very, very similar to one another. All life that we know turns out to be based on the chemistry of carbon. And that's because carbon forms bonds that are not too strong, but not too weak. They're strong enough to hold things together, so DNA or RNA can hold together pretty good, but weak enough so you can actually have the double helix replicate itself, that these things can actually bond and unbond, and RNA can act in the molecule. RNA can actually work in cells and do what it needs to do. And carbon molecules also are very easy to transport in water as a solvent. Water is very, very common in the universe, and so a solvent is necessary to move all the chemicals back and forth. And so that's one reason that carbon chemistry is what life is based on. And so that's the basics of life right there. There have been speculations that other atoms like silicon, which have certain properties similar to carbon, might work, except silicon forms bonds that are way too strong. And so the only way you'd have life with silicon-based life would be primarily if it were at higher temperatures, but then you have problem with solvents. So they're still thinking carbon chemistry, because carbon is one of the most common things produced in stars too as they die. So that would be a very common sort of thing that's out there. Water is very common, so you have all the right ingredients to make life very common. The carbon chemistry is also based here on several specific molecules. Okay, some amino acids here that form the basics of DNA. Now, the interesting thing is that these amino acids actually have an interesting property. When you put all the stuff together, they can be twisted one way or twisted another way. So they're not really two-dimensional as they are in this picture. They have little bends in them, and when you put them together, that means that DNA has this left-handed twist. All DNA does. Every organism on Earth, all these have the same isomers, the same twists to them. And so that means if you were to eat sugar that was chemically the same as sugar, it would taste like sugar to you, but your body could not process it. And so that's one way of making a type of artificial sweetener. But likewise, if you go to another planet that has right-handed molecules in there, and you were to have a right-handed cow, okay, or a cow made of right-handed molecules, you could eat it, but your body couldn't process it, and so you could get no nourishment out of it. And so again, all life on Earth has the same twist. It's a 50-50 chance it's one way or the other. So why is it one way, all life on Earth? We don't know. If we find life elsewhere, if all life we find is left-handed twist, that's really significant. Be equally significant if we found any right-handed twist life. And so we still don't really know all the details here, but they're studying the possibilities. Again, DNA is important because it can replicate, and so that allows life to reproduce. It also allows life to evolve or change, because a very small variation in this replication can then change